Welcome everyone to LAMFcast. This program is made possible by legacy funding from the Five Wings Arts Council and the Minnesota State Arts Board. Today's lecture is connected to our 2021 opera, The Rake's Progress by Igor Stravinsky. That'll take place on August 14th and 15th. And it's sponsored by Ruthie Geminder, Lemieux Wealth Strategies, Karn and Malin Schneider, and Bircher Design and Construction. And it's my pleasure to welcome our lecturer today. Paul Hopper is the Associate Artistic Administrator at the Metropolitan Opera. He is one of LAMF's new artistic advisors and also one of the original 5 musicians who came to the Brainerd Lakes area in 2009. In the very first year of Lakes Area Music Festival. So welcome, Paul, and enjoy this lecture. And don't forget to ask those questions.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Taylor, for that introduction. It's so great to see you from afar. I'm coming to you from my apartment in New York City, as in my position at the Met, very eagerly and excitingly getting ready to open our season this September after being quiet for over a year and a half. So I know that you all out in Brainerd are looking forward to some live performances in the coming weeks, and I definitely share that sentiment with you as well. I'm very excited to be here to talk to you a little bit about The Rake's Progress. This opera I find to be an incredibly exciting, stimulating, and surprisingly accessible piece composed by Igor Stravinsky, which premiered in 1951. The Rake's Progress, even within Stravinsky's compositional output, has a very distinct compositional style that we'll unpack, especially in comparison to some of Stravinsky's other works, which you may or may not be familiar with. If we look at this opera also within the repertoire at LAMF, it is also unlike anything that you've seen with the company. If you've been with the company for a while, we've seen a broad swath of the repertoire, some classics like The Magic Flute and La Bohème and Carmen, some works like La Cenerentola and Hansel and Gretel, Offenbach's La Belle Hélène, which I know was a fabulously fun and frothy piece. But of the works that LAMF has produced, The Rake's Progress, at least in a compositional timeline, falls the most closely to Britten's A Midsummer Night's Dream. But that was composed in 1960, so about 9 years after The Rake's Progress. But that is about where the similarities end. These pieces are very different stylistically, musically, thematically, but interestingly, they both looked to the past for the inspiration for the story. Now, we haven't seen much Stravinsky at LAMF, but as Taylor pointed out, I was involved in the very early seasons of the festival, and we did see some Stravinsky, specifically The Rake's Progress, at one of the very first Night at the Opera performances, where I actually sang the role of Tom Rakewell in the epilogue. And I wanted to point that out because the epilogue at the very end of the opera really highlights the sort of moral of the tale of this opera. This is definitely a morality opera where they are making some, rather important comments on society. And so one of the final lines in the epilogue is as follows. They say, "For idle hearts and hands and minds, the devil finds work to do." The Rake's Progress is really a morality tale about the downfall of a man named Tom Rakewell. And already in the title and the title character, we see some of this symbolism. We also see Stravinsky and his collaborators looking backwards. A rake, R-A-K-E, that we see both in Tom Rakewell's name and in the title of the opera, is a term that first originated in the 17th and 18th centuries. And a rake is a man who dabbles in a lot of immoral conduct. This type of archetype is often wasting an inherited fortune on gambling, on booze, on women, on music, on entertainment. And that is exactly the story that we follow. The Rake's Progress or the progress of a rake, is really following the downfall of this rake named Tom Rakewell. Over the course of the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to introduce you to a little bit more about Stravinsky as a composer, and specifically his three main compositional periods, of which the Rake's Progress falls right in the middle in his neoclassical phase, in his period. I'll play a couple audio samples as well from two of the different periods. I'm then going to spend some time looking at the inspiration for the opera, which, composers find inspiration everywhere. Sometimes they're plays, sometimes they're poems, sometimes it's historical events, but this was actually inspired by a series of 8 engravings that were turned into paintings. So we're gonna look at these pictures as well. To look at the inspiration, we'll sort of put ourselves in Stravinsky's shoes, but it'll also help us learn the story of the Rake's Progress because it follows the story of these paintings very closely. I'll also at the end get to introduce you to our fabulous cast for this production, which I had a hand in putting together along with Taylor and Scott. And at the end, if you have any questions, we'll have a few minutes for that as well. So as they come up, if they come up throughout the course of the lecture, feel free to put them in the chat. If you're on Zoom or if you're on Facebook, you can comment there and they'll be shared with us here. And we'll see if we can answer some of your questions at the end. So I'd like to start by talking a little bit about Igor Stravinsky, the composer. Stravinsky was born in 1882 in Russia, but he later became a French citizen in 1934 and then an American citizen in 1945. As Stravinsky's citizenship and location and worldliness evolved, so did his compositional styles. This was very common, especially in the 20th century, with composers who were leaving European or Russian countries and coming to the United States. Kurt Weill is a fantastic example of that. We see his compositions change as he changes locations. The first period of Stravinsky's output is really known as his Russian period, which makes sense since that's where he was born. He was a student of Rimsky-Korsakov, another fantastic Russian composer, and Stravinsky found early success with ballets, actually. They were commissioned by the impresario and choreographer Sergei Diaghilev. The big three that really kicked off Stravinsky's career spanned from 1910 to 1913. In just those 3 years, because of the help of Diaghilev, Stravinsky composed some probably familiar names: Firebird, Petrushka, and The Rite of Spring. So if you're a ballet fan or a symphonic fan, since we often see these on concert programs as well, some of those may be familiar titles to you. Specifically, The Rite of Spring was really transformative in Stravinsky's career and really the trajectory of 20th century classical music. Specifically, within The Rite of Spring, we see Stravinsky revolutionizing rhythmic structure and being very innovative with harmonies. We see really excessive syncopation, unexpected offbeats, and if you listen to these pieces now, it's really important to think about what it would have sounded like in the very early years of the 20th century. Now, there are some crazy rumors about what happened the night of the premiere of The Rite of Spring. And if you want to dive deeper on this, I encourage you to do so because some of the stories are just, they're amazing. There are stories of riots happening inside and outside of the theater. There are screams coming from the audience because people were so disturbed by what they were hearing from the orchestra and seeing on stage in this ballet. And some of you might be familiar with this piece, as I said, but if this is your reference point for Stravinsky, The Rite of Spring, I am either delighted or very disappointed to tell you that it is really not representative of the Rake's Progress at all. In a little bit, I'll play a clip from The Rite of Spring as well as a clip from the Rake's Progress. So you can see just how different these pieces are on like the compositional spectrum. After the Russian period, as we see him move to France and then eventually to the States where he composed the Rake's Progress, we see Stravinsky entering into the neoclassical period. And again, this is where we find the Rake's Progress. In this moment, in the middle of Stravinsky's career, we see the pendulum swinging. If we look at his early Russian period as going so far to almost an avant-garde, look at composition, looking to shock, looking to find the unexpected. In the neoclassical period, we see him swinging all the way to the other side of the spectrum, looking backwards. Neoclassicism refers to composers of the 20th century who were really looking to the 17th and 18th century for inspiration of stories, but also inspiration for their compositional style. But it's all through the lens of the 20th century. So we see things like fugues or grand symphonies or concertos or opera, some of the things that we see in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and early 19th century. But again, with this avant-garde lens put on top of it. So to point out the differences between the two of these, I'm going to play two short audio clips for you. The first one is going to be from The Rite of Spring, from his Russian period. And then after that, we'll look at the neoclassical period, specifically the introduction to one of the arias in the Rake's Progress. So if you give me just 1 second to shift over, this first one will be on the louder side. So if you're listening on big speakers, I'm warning you now. But this is an example of his Russian period and that avant-garde, crunchy, challenging music. This is the sacrificial dance from The Rite of Spring. When audiences heard this music at its premiere, it made them very uncomfortable, especially if we think of some of the other composers at the time. If an audience member was a big Puccini fan, who was also composing right around the turn of the 20th century, this would have been rather disturbing and unexpected for them. Now, as we look to the Rake's Progress then, again, we see him looking backwards and rediscovering melody even. Much of that Rite of Spring passage, you're not humming the tunes afterwards. You might be tapping your toe and trying to catch the beat, but then it goes in a very unexpected way. So on the other side of the spectrum, we have this neoclassical period. This selection that I'm going to play for you now is Anne Truelove's aria, No Word from Tom. And I'm going to play this opening, which is feels like chamber music within a big grand opera. This is scored for double clarinet and bassoon. It's almost like a mini trio with a beautiful melodic introduction. So here's a little bit of the introduction to No Word from Tom. two very different ends of the spectrum. And I wanted to play those two side by side because, again, for many people, the immediate thought of Stravinsky is The Rite of Spring, which is a fantastic piece. But I don't want that to scare anybody away from really being open to this period of Stravinsky's output. For me, that sounds like, you know, almost like a little Beethoven trio, a piece of chamber music. And yet, when you study it and you look very closely, it's incredibly complex. There are surprising moments of dissonance. There are, if for the music theory fans out there, there are chords that you think should resolve in one direction, and then he takes it in another way. And then he sort of plays with that breaking of familiar molds again. There's this beautiful long introduction, and then the soprano begins singing a cappella, unaccompanied. This ends up being a rather grand 7.5 minute scene aria type of thing. And it's just one of the best moments in the opera, in my opinion. Okay, so back to this piece within Stravinsky's compositional output. The Rake's Progress premiered, although it was composed mostly while he lived in the United States. It premiered in Venice, Italy in 1951. And then it had its American debut at the Metropolitan Opera in 1953. And then it went on to Santa Fe Opera for their 1962 Stravinsky Festival, which celebrated his 80th birthday. They actually have a terrace named after him at the Santa Fe Opera because he had a very long affinity with the company. We do still see this piece appearing in major American opera houses as well. The Lyric Opera of Chicago was scheduled to do it last season, which was of course canceled. And the Met will produce it at the very end of our season in May and June of next season. Now, following the neoclassical period, we do see a third and final period from Stravinsky. This is his serial period. This is where we see him experimenting with 12-tone music, similar to Schoenberg, if you're familiar with some of his compositions. But arguably with Stravinsky, this was his least successful or popular period. We don't have those sort of famous pieces coming out of this period, but it was interesting to see him enter this period in the third chapter of his compositional output. Stravinsky himself was a very worldly gentleman, again, because of this, his varying locations. And he also operated in a very high level of elite musical and creative circles. As I mentioned, he was trained by Rimsky-Korsakov in his early days, but he also had a very intimate working relationship with Pablo Picasso, specifically on the ballet Pulcinella, which Picasso designed and Stravinsky composed. Interesting, they would actually trade pieces of art with each other as a way of collaboration to get to know each other, but also out of mutual respect for each other. So Picasso actually did a portrait of Stravinsky, which I encourage you to take a look at. And then Stravinsky even wrote a piece specifically for Picasso. It's a sketch of music for the clarinet. Stravinsky did die in the United States, in New York City, actually in 1971. But for now, I want to turn back to where he found the inspiration for the Rake's Progress. The inspiration for this opera, as I mentioned at the top of the lecture, actually comes from a series of 18th century engravings that were turned into paintings by an artist named William Hogarth. The pieces are currently housed in London in the Sir John Soanes Museum, but Stravinsky saw them by stumbling into an art gallery in Chicago, or a museum, when they were on display. They were finished in 1734, and there are a series of 8 images. Now we're going to look through all 8 of them together in a moment, but it's interesting that these 8 pieces are not a standalone collection of artworks. It really is a through composed narrative story, almost like a play through these 8 images. We don't see tons of this in the art world. We see, triptychs in some religious art where we tell 3 religious stories through it. But to see 8 separate paintings tell one story makes it very unique. Now, given Stravinsky's interest in neoclassicism and looking backwards, are we surprised that he found inspiration from, at that point, a 213-year-old piece of art that happened to be right in the middle of the classical period? I don't think so. There was something about this fortuitous run-in with these pieces of art that really spoke with him. So in this series of 8 paintings, we see the moral and physical journey of Tom Rakewell and his wife, Sarah Young. In the opera, this is Anne Truelove, but in the paintings, she was named Sarah. There's many similarities in the opera, which we'll discuss in detail, but there are some interesting differences as well. Throughout this story, we see the consequences of Tom's moral choices. He fits the bill of a rake. He comes into a large fortune. He suffers through shame and debt and degradation, eventually madness, and finally death. So this also feels incredibly operatic. You could feel that Stravinsky almost could see the opera jumping off the page. The character of Sarah offers him many opportunities for redemption also, and yet he never accepts them. Tom, again, is really an archetype of an immoral young man. This is very in direct contrast to his wife. Sarah's love, or Anne's love, in the opera is continuous and unending. She even offers all of her money and would do anything to save him. Now, again, as soon as Stravinsky saw these paintings, he knew it was an opera, but he knew that he needed a librettist whose native language was English to really help him turn these paintings into a story. So for that, he turned to W.H. Auden, who was a poet who at the time was writing on politics, morals, love, and religion. Auden was an Englishman turned American citizen, which also is very similar to Stravinsky. If you're familiar with Auden's writing, it's very elevated. Sometimes it's very stylized. And again, it almost feels as if it's people speaking like they're in another time. Again, sounds very neoclassical, the 20th century looking backwards. They did also collaborate with Chester Kallman in the libretto, but much of it is attributed to W.H. Auden. So I'd like to take some time to look through these 8 engravings and to put ourselves into Stravinsky's shoes to see why he was so interested in turning this to an opera. So give me 1 second to shift over again so we can get some images on the screen. Great. So this first image is called The Heir. In it, we see Tom Rakewell right here. This is the character of Tom. This is the moment where he has just found out that a huge fortune has been left to him by his rather miserly and cheap father. And he begins to spend money right away. In this scene, we see him being measured for a suit. We also see Sarah over here weeping. She is at this time pregnant with their child. And then we see Tom's mother in between them, right in between them. We see her trying to actually buy off Sarah. It's hard to see, but there's money in her hand, trying to get her out of the picture. The mother of Tom is not a character in the opera. We actually get to see Anne's father, which I'll introduce you to later. But we see this conflict of money and wealth and his life changing. Again, we see people sort of fixing up the room that he's in, and his life is about to change. The second of the 8 paintings is called The Levee. This is when we see Tom out in the world enjoying his money. We find ourselves in a very classical, elegant interior, surrounded by people who are trying to mooch off of him and to get his money. So here we see Tom all dressed up in his new outfit, and we see a lot of eyes on him, kind of keeping an eye out on him. We even have a little nod to Handel actually, in this piece. We have a wigged man playing at the harpsichord. Now, all of these men know that Tom is not a responsible young man, and they're trying to befriend him in order to take advantage of him. The third image of the series is called the orgy. As I said, the archetype of the rake loved all of the pleasures of life. So here we find him in a brothel, surrounded by women, enjoying all of the pleasures of life. But we even see people taking advantage of him in this picture too. If you look very closely, Tom right here is being seduced by this woman, and she has taken his pocket watch and is handing it off to her friend. We see this in the opera The Rake's Progress too. We see everybody trying to take advantage of this young man. Things turn sour for Tom in this series as well. The fourth image is called The Arrest. At this point, he is very far in debt. He has been spending too much of his money. We see him in the suit that he was being fit for at the very beginning, but it's rather ragged and run down at this point. Sarah comes to try and help him. She has become a milliner. We know that based off of this box with the trims and the fabrics on her hip. And she has come with her life savings in this little pocket to try and save Tom. And yet he doesn't accept it. This character, the Anne Truelove character, is almost an angel of mercy. I love how they changed her name for the opera into Anne Truelove, because we see the allegory or the symbolism there. Her love is true. It is never ending, and it is very sincere, even when the man that she loves offers him very few reasons to stay in love. The fifth image is called The Marriage, but it is not a marriage to Anne Truelove, and we see this in the opera as well. In here, we see Tom finding out how to get out of this pickle that he's found himself in. He has spent all of his money that he has inherited, so his decision, this is Tom here, is to marry an old, ugly, rich woman who is right here. This happens in the opera too. The character's name is Baba the Turk, which I'll introduce you to at the end. And we see Sarah or Anne in the background, again, trying to help, trying to intervene, trying to save this man, but she's not even allowed in. Interestingly, Tom is already in his marriage to this older woman. He's not looking at her, he is looking at her maid over here. So we can only guess that this is probably not going to end well for him either. The sixth image is called The Gaming House. Here we have Tom with his newfound fortune after marrying yet another woman, gambling it all away in a gaming house. We see Tom down here, sort of stripped of the powdered wig, but we see him actually on the ground in this image, begging to God or to the Almighty for assistance. He knows he's messed up again, but he's so deep into this process that we're realizing that he really cannot get out of it. The second to last image is called The Prison, where unfortunately Tom is now incarcerated and in a jail for people specifically in debt. We see Tom here looking rather ragged and down in the dumps. And at this point, both his first and second wife have arrived trying to help him. Here we see Sarah or Anne, who has really passed out and is needing to be revived. Then we see his second wife here trying to help him. In this image, we also see signs of him starting to go mad, which we see in the opera as well. If you actually look back here, it's a little hard to see. This is a telescope for him to look out into the sky. In the 18th century, stargazing like this was often thought to be a sign of madness. Now, in the eighth and final image, we find him in the madhouse. This is the title of the eighth image. Tom has gone mad, and here he is in London's infamous Bethlem Hospital, also known as Bedlam. And there's a scene in the opera that parallels this perfectly. We see Tom and Sarah or Anne in the final moments of his life. She is sobbing, and yet she is still by his side. She has stuck with him through it all. This is where the series ends. One other thing to point out, you may be wondering, who are these rather well-dressed people in Bedlam, in this asylum? This was actually a rather common occasion in the 18th century. Well-dressed nobility would visit the asylum as a social occasion. So we see the people that he desperately wanted to be part of now looking down on him in a lower level. So how is this similar to the opera? I pointed a lot of this out already. We have some similar characters. Of course, Tom Rakewell. Much of what we just saw, you'll see in the opera. He goes to London after inheriting a huge fortune. He lives a life of debauchery. He loses it all. He marries another woman, goes mad, and ends up in an insane asylum. The paintings really follow Tom's journey, but in the opera, we get to learn so much more about his wife, who we'll just call Anne Truelove from now on. Anne Truelove in the opera, it opens with her living in the country with her father before Tom has inherited the money. She's a sweet, beautiful young woman who has fallen in love with this, at this time, very charismatic man with big, big dreams. As I mentioned, we do get to meet in the opera Anne's father, Father Truelove, who we don't see in the etchings. He's very skeptical about Tom as a choice for Anne as a life partner, but she has faith. And she maintains this faith and her love for Tom even as she watches him unravel. There's no pregnancy and no child in this story, but you still feel that emotional connection. Similar to the etchings, we do have the character of the second marriage of Tom. In this opera, her name is Baba the Turk. This is sort of almost a surrealist 20th century take on the old hag. She's often portrayed as a bearded lady because of this. And then there are the characters that are not in the opera. Anne's father, as I mentioned, Father Truelove. But most interestingly is a character named Nick Shadow. Early in the opera, before Tom learns about the inheritance, Nick Shadow, who is just a stranger, quite literally just appears in front of him. Tom doesn't really know who this guy is, but he's quite charming. They strike up a conversation, and Tom complains about being poor. Nick, this stranger that arrives, tells Tom that he actually had an uncle that just died and left him a huge fortune, again, like we just see in the paintings. Nick Shadow offers to accompany him to London to collect the money and take him away from Anne. And because of this, Tom agrees to pay Nick Shadow a salary for a year and a day. And they shake on it and they strike a deal. And off he goes to London, leaving Anne at home with her father. At the end of this first scene with Tom and Nick Shadow turns to the audience and sort of addresses us directly and says, "The progress of a rake begins." Now, if you've been listening to this lecture closely, we've been talking about the symbolism, and we hear Nick Shadow, even in the names. Nick is really an allegorical devil character. Depending on the production, this can either be played up or played down. But if you think of the Faust story, either Goethe's Faust or Gounod's operatic setting of Faust and Mephistopheles, this is sort of the Mephistopheles character, the charming devil who arrives on the scene, strikes a deal with an offer to change your life. But as we know, deals with the devil rarely end well, and there are often consequences. And we do see that in the opera as well. As we wrap up in the final minutes, I just wanted to introduce you to the cast that we've put together for this opera. As artistic advisor, I work closely with Taylor and with Scott on the vocal casting. And let me just shift back over. Here we have the majority of the principal characters for The Rake's Progress. On the top left, we have Miles Mikkonen, who will be singing the role of Tom Rakewell in his Lakes Area debut. Miles is on Candide at Tanglewood. He was a winner of the Metropolitan Opera's annual competition that led to his debut in Wozzeck in the 1920s season. And he'll return to the Met this fall to sing The Holy Fool in Boris Godunov and Vogelgesang in Die Meistersinger. Next, we have Brandy Sutton singing the role of Anne Truelove. If you saw the Winter Series recital that I curated, you're familiar with Brandy's beautiful singing and very captivating stage presence. I have sort of a neoclassical background with Brandy, actually. I first heard her singing Pamina in the Magic Flute at Kentucky Opera, which led to bringing her to the Met. At the Met, she will sing the fairy godmother in Massenet's setting of the Cinderella story this winter. Next, a man who needs no introduction since he introduced himself at the beginning of this, John Taylor Ward, singing the role of Nick Shadow. I know you're all familiar with Taylor, and I know that you also agree that he'll play a devil quite well, I think. Down in the bottom left, we have Andrew Potter, who will be singing the role of Father Truelove, a very rich bass sound, singing some of the large bass repertoire like Hunding in Die Walküre and Vodnik in Dvorak's Rusalka. In the center on the bottom, Sarah Kudin singing the role of Baba the Turk, really a consummate singing actress, which is needed for this role that has a lot of comedic moments as well. She also has lots of Baroque experience, singing lots of Handel and new works, sort of a neoclassical artist of her own. And then the production will be conducted by LAMF's new music director, Christian Reif. So I know that everybody is eagerly looking forward to the performances, which will be on August 14th and 15th. And of course, the season with LAMF kicks off on July 30th before then. So I'm going to end my screen sharing and just see if we have any questions from the audience. I'm not an encyclopedia, but I will see if I can answer any. Hello to all of our friends watching, Tim and Barb Zander from Wisconsin, Andrew Meir in Brainerd. How do Stravinsky's music and Auden's libretto depict the two-dimensionalness of Hogarth's work? That's a very interesting question. I think we can look back to the neoclassicism of this. The classical period is really rooted in form and in structure. And it is not like the 3D compositions that we see in his early ballets or in the works of Richard Strauss or even Puccini, which is all happening around the same time. So we see them almost compressing the music back into formal structures in more of a two-dimensional setting. Another question, and our last question for the day. As an artistic advisor, what are my hopes and dreams for LAMF's vocal programming in the future? That's a fantastic question because I have enjoyed watching this festival grow over the last decade now, from its very early seasons into what it is now, especially moving into this new performance space, which I think will open up an entire new chapter. To have an orchestra pit of that size for opera particularly opens up a whole new swath of repertoire, you know? Oftentimes companies are limited by space, the physical space that they have, but with this new performing arts center in Brainerd, the sky's the limit. I mean, I don't want to throw out too many titles to get too many people excited, but it does open up a new chapter of operas that could be programmed. Outside of the operas, I think in the vocal programming, it's an opportunity to look at more living composers and composers of color and people who are telling stories of people today. I think that one of the great things about LAMF is the broad spectrum of the works. We have everything from new works to 20th century works to very early Baroque pieces. Often, if you caught Chloe Fedor's artistic advisor winter series, also we saw her looking at the Baroque pieces. So for me, in the vocal trajectory, if we keep looking forward, I think we need to keep looking towards new works, living composers, commissions of new works to add to the repertoire, because I very firmly believe that we as producing organizations should never be museums. We're not only looking backwards, we're constantly growing and moving forward. So I've gone a few minutes over, but there's just so much to talk about with this great piece. And I do hope that this, if you were looking forward to this piece, it gives you some things to think about looking over the next couple weeks, maybe some things to research, because I know we have some avid scholars in this group. And for those who are wondering, is the Rake's Progress for me? I hope you see that this really is. It's an exciting and interesting story that balances multiple styles and experiences, and it's going to be one heck of a show. So I wish you all a wonderful summer, and in the coming weeks that you attend as much of the LAMF programming as possible, starting with the kickoff concert and then ending towards the end of the festival with the Rake's Progress. So thank you so much for joining me today, and look forward to seeing you all again very soon.